accomplish in the Bolshevik Revolution?
You create opposing forces which you place in conflict. Out of conflict, you've got profit, you've got political power, and you can direct history. And if you look at the writings, for example, of the Trilateral Commission, they talk openly in the Trilateral Commission about managing conflicts, not solving conflicts, but managing conflicts. Conflict management, that's the cry.
So they got the profit, the power, and the management. Mm-hmm. Where did they want to steer history through the Bolshevik Revolution?
They wanted to set up, and they did, two opposing forces. Out of that came World War II. There were logical steps in the process. They used the same bank, Guaranteed Trust Company, as the conduit for the financing of Hitler, and also as a conduit for financing and also the early days of the Russian Revolution. In fact, in Russia, Soviet Russia in 1923, a vice president of Guaranteed Trust Company was the foreign director of the Roscombank, which was the first Soviet overseas bank that was set up. They were that close in those days.
The pilot would say goodbye to his companions the night before and distribute among them his meager possessions and what money he had, carrying with him only a few charms.
The Japanese kamikaze pilots would probably carry several charms or talismans. Normally they'd have a headband pronouncing certain victory or sure to kill the Americans. They might have a flag inscribed with the names of other members of their units wishing them success on their mission. And possibly some would have a 1,000-stitch belt. This was what amounted to a belly band, and each stitch was collected by a mother, a girlfriend, a wife on street corners of cities or towns. They asked individuals to add one stitch at a time, so that the 1,000 stitches would bring the wearer good luck and good fortune.
This is my argument that specific beliefs have consequences. This is my argument that specific beliefs have consequences. This is my argument that specific beliefs have consequences.
Some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them. Religious faith should no longer be tolerated. To kill people for believing. It comes time to organize a global civilization. To kill people for believing them. It comes time to organize a global civilization. To kill people for believing. I'm arguing for a certain kind of intolerance. To kill people for believing. It comes time to organize a global civilization.
happen to us is to discover that God exists. The worst thing that would ever happen to us is to discover that God exists. The worst thing that would ever happen to us is to discover that God exists. Was the idea that there is being, pure and simple. And pure being depends on nothing. But does he exist? Not in this sense, because that would make him what? A creature, a dependent, derived existence. But rather we say God is here. God is being. The worst thing that would ever happen to us is to discover that God exists.
Twice, shame on me.
There's an old saying on earth, Mr. Sulu. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, you can't get fooled again.
Big a fool can one girl be? For once you made a fool of me, and now I've made a fool out of myself. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Religious extremism and Christian fundamentalism in this country very, very seriously. Movements that fuse the iconography and language of religion with the iconography and language of nationalism, something that I saw in the former Yugoslavia. Cover as the Balkan bureau chief there for the New York Times during the war, is toxic and extremely dangerous and proto-fascist. Following this book, I was invited in May of last year to Royce Hall at UCLA to debate Sam Harris, author of The End of Faith and Letter to a Christian Nation, and 2 days later flew to San Francisco and went to Berkeley to debate Christopher Hitchens, author of God is Not Great. Now, any serious student of theology cannot have a complete education without paying homage to the importance of atheism in the Western intellectual tradition. First of all, most of the great philosophical and theological reformers were condemned in their day as atheists and heretics. One thinks of Spinoza or even Martin Luther. I don't think anyone who has a complete education in theology can ignore the wisdom of Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, he was also insane, but there were parts of him that were brilliant. He certainly understood the consequences of a culture where God was dead, the kind of moral nihilism and the will to power that I think have very much come to characterize the ethos of modern society. Writers such as Sartre and Camus are serious and should be taken seriously and heeded for their deep insights into the human condition. So I actually came towards these new atheists fairly predisposed to accept the tradition that they said they represented. Upon reading their works, however, and engaging in a debate with them, I was appalled to find that what they had done is essentially replicate the fundamentalist beliefs of Christian conservatives with secular language, in secular garb. That they had, like the radical Christian right, created a binary worldview of us and them, of good and evil, of black and white. They externalize evil in the same way the Christian right does. Evil is not something within the human heart, endemic to all of us, something that we must all struggle against. But evil is a force out there that once we eradicate will allow us to advance forward morally, if not to a perfect society, to a more perfect society. This kind of utopian vision, wedded to the dangerous belief that violence can be used to advance this vision, to purify the world, is characteristic of most utopian movements. And these movements have been the curse of modern society since probably the Jacobins in France. It goes back, of course, to the Enlightenment itself. The Enlightenment was a blessing in many ways, a reaction to the anti-intellectualism, repression, superstition, bigotry of the church, but it was also a curse. What the Enlightenment did is it adopted the notion of the linear notion of time, which is a product, a peculiar product actually, of the Hebraic and the Christian traditions. The perfect society, or the city of God, could only be created by God. That it was incapable of being created by humankind because we were endemically flawed. The Enlightenment jettisoned this idea and put their faith in science, rational human beings, and knowledge as a way to advance humankind and create a more perfect world. This belief is extremely dangerous because it is a short step, as the Jacobins proved with the Committee of Virtue and the Reign of Terror, that once you define certain groups of human beings as impediments to that progress, if you believe that they are incapable of being converted or reformed, then they must be eradicated. And I think the vast killing projects that we saw in the last century by communists and fascists is directly tied to that Enlightenment vision. The new atheists argue in some ways along these lines, but what they have done, I think, like many utopians, is distort the the very disciplines that they claim as the basis for their ideology. They have essentially created a definition of religion that embodies all evil. Religion is responsible for violence, for superstition, for ignorance, and certainly there's no question that religious groups have and religious institutions are culpable to this charge. But this simplistic view of the world, which I think is very much replicated by the radical Christian right, ignores the complexity and the ambiguity and the outside forces that go into creating fanaticism. One of the things that disturbs me most about the radical Christian right and the new atheists is this self-exaltation, this elevation of us above others, the kind of moral superiority, the relegating of other people to moral inferior levels. The kinds of things that the new atheists, for example, write about Muslims could be lifted from the most rabid sermon by a Christian fundamentalist. Their political agenda completely converges, and I think that's not accidental. Their political agenda completely converges, and I think that's not accidental. Their political agenda completely converges, and I think that's not accidental. Their political agenda completely converges, and I think that's not accidental. For example, Sam Harris, in his book, The End of Faith, asks us to consider carrying out a nuclear first strike on the Arab world, admitting that this, in his words, would be a crime that would kill tens of millions of people, but it may be something that we have to do given what these people believe. This kind of utopianism, this kind of belief that massive catastrophic violence will propel the world forward, I think is endemic within American society. The war in Iraq, for example, is a utopian project. If you take the roughly 10,000 Arabists in this country, and by that I mean people who speak Arabic and have spent a prolonged period of time in the Middle East, I don't think you could have found more than 10 that believed invading and occupying Iraq was a good idea. That somehow Iraqis would greet us as liberators, that democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and spread outwards throughout the Middle East, and that the oil revenues would pay for reconstruction. This was a non-reality based belief system, and it's something that was embraced by the radical Christian right, by the neocons, and is embraced by those people who identify themselves as new atheists. What I fear is that at the core of both of these movements, there is a kind of celebration of ignorance. These people are culturally, and I'm talking about both the radical Christian right and the new atheists, they are culturally, historically, and linguistically illiterate. They know nothing about the Middle East and nothing about religion. At the core of both of these movements, there is a kind of celebration of ignorance. These people are culturally, and I'm talking about both the radical Christian right and the new atheists, they are culturally, historically, and linguistically illiterate. These people are culturally, and I'm talking about both the radical Christian right and the new atheists, they are culturally, historically, and linguistically illiterate. These people are culturally, and I'm talking about both the radical Christian right and the new atheists. They are culturally, historically, and linguistically illiterate. They know nothing about the Middle East and nothing about religion.
Yeah, lots of stuff coming up. Okay, well today I'd like to talk about the idea of redefining words. As atheists, we end up debating Christians a lot, or other theists on various topics, or sometimes you'll see Christians on various TV shows making various claims, and they're using words in doing that, and it's sort of important that everybody use the same words, right? That their meanings aren't being shifted around, and it's sort of important that everybody use the same words, right? That their meanings aren't being shifted around, and that's kind of the theme of today's show: is the shifting meaning of words. And sometimes words are intentionally redefined. Sometimes they have ambiguous meanings. Sometimes they are changed from their original context, or sometimes they're done to spin things, and this can be either out of ignorance or out of deception. Sometimes they're done to spin things, and this can be either out of ignorance or out of deception. Or out of ignorance or out of deception. Or out of ignorance or out of deception. Or out of ignorance or out of deception. So this is sort of one little tactic, I think, as part of what we see when we're debating theists as what I would call the apologetics aerobics, right? Where people want to hold on to their God belief or hold on to their favorite line of thinking, and they're willing to redefine words in order to do that. Hold on to their favorite line of thinking, and they're willing to redefine words in order to do that. And hold on to their favorite line of thinking, and they're willing to redefine words in order to do that. And hold on to their favorite line of thinking, and they're willing to redefine words in order to do that. And once you sort of get to the redefining of words, then you're sort of at a dead end, right?
resident skeptic. Thank you for writing to us about the entry on atheism and agnosticism. We have received messages about this issue before and are continuing to consider whether and how the entry might be adjusted. It said, the matter is not as clear-cut as you suggest. While the term atheism is used in a variety of ways in general discourse, our entry is on its meaning in the philosophical literature. Traditionally speaking, the definition in our entry, that atheism means the denial of the existence of God, is correct in the philosophical literature. Some now refer to the standard meaning as positive atheism and contrast it with the broader notion of negative atheism, which has the meaning you suggest, that atheism simply means not the best. In our understanding, the argument for this broader notion was introduced into the philosophical literature by Antony Flew in The Presumption of Atheism 1972. In that work, he noted that he was using an etymological argument to try to convince people not to follow the standard meaning of the term. His goal was to reframe the debate about the existence of God and to rebrand atheism as a default position. Not everyone has been convinced to use the term in Flew's way simply on the force of his argument. For some, who consider themselves atheists in the traditional sense, Flew's efforts seem to be an attempt to water down a perfectly good concept. For others, who consider themselves agnostics in the traditional sense, Flew's efforts seem to be an attempt to relabel them atheists, a term they rejected. All that said, we are continuing to examine the situation regarding the definitions as presented in this entry. Barry Nodelman, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Senior Editor, Stanford University. Stanford, California.
What were some of the factors that prompted you to, in recent years, reconsider atheism and to come to the conclusion that that there is a intelligence?
It's been entirely these, I suppose, biological discoveries and discoveries about the chemistry.
So
these things.
The complexity and...
yeah, the integrated complexity argument.
So these things. The complexity and...
yeah, the integrated complexity argument.
What about atheism? Well, I hate to correct him about his definition of atheism, but he's simply wrong. Atheism is not just the absence of belief in God. Let me turn to the standard work in the field of philosophy, standard reference work, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It quotes, according to the most usual definition, an atheist is a person who maintains that there is no God. In contrast, an agnostic maintains that it is not known or cannot be known whether there is a God. Mr. Zindler has clearly confused agnosticism with atheism. And the debate tonight is supposed to be over atheism, the proposition that there is no God. And so I invite him again, defend that point of view. I've come here to debate, give me some arguments for atheism so that I can deal with them. Madeleine Murray O'Hare, in an interview in Life magazine, said that agnostics are just atheists without guts because they're afraid to speak up. So We're not here to just talk about agnosticism. I want to hear the arguments for atheism. Why is that important? Well, simply this. Even if all the evidence that I gave for Christianity is wrong, that doesn't prove that God does not exist. Kai Nielsen, an atheist philosopher, writes, to show that an argument is invalid or unsound is not to show that the conclusion of the argument is false. All the proofs of God's existence may fail, but it still may be the case that God exists. In short, to show that the proofs do not work is not enough by itself. It may still be the case that there is a God. So he's got to give us a positive case for why God does not exist.
Give me the brief thesis as to why we should not believe in God.
Well, why we shouldn't believe in God really depends on what you mean by belief. Whether or not we should accept the arguments really has to do with whether they correspond with the facts.
Well, there can be no absolute certainty that there isn't or there is. I mean, obviously, you're an intelligent man. You would never say atheist, and atheism is rationally impossible. You're an intelligent man. You would never say atheist, and atheism is rationally impossible. Atheism is rationally impossible. Atheism is rationally impossible. Atheism is rationally impossible. Why, speaking to viewers out there, hundreds of thousands of people watching, why would you say to them, God is irrelevant, don't bother?
Well, I would say that it's more important actually for them to examine the reasons why they would believe in God. I don't think that it's necessary for people to have arguments for being atheists, rather that they should come to the conclusion that makes the most sense to them. You should investigate it. I just think that that would lead to someone to be an atheist.
We seem to be going around in circles here. But the reason we're having the debate is, does God exist? So obviously, it's a self-evident truth that I believe in debate on these issues.
Right.
I want you to tell people why they shouldn't believe, if you want to use the semantics, why they shouldn't imagine there's a God. Show me how there's no God. Give me proof that God doesn't exist.
Well, we can't prove a negative. I think that's why we're going around in circles. Like, I can't prove the non-existence of...
Give me an argument.
There are different schools of atheism, as you say, but there's no claim I know how to make that says atheism is true, because atheism is the statement that a certain proposition isn't true. There's no claim I know how to make that says atheism is true. There's no claim I know how to make that says atheism is true. There's no claim I know how to make that says atheism is true. There's no claim I know how to make that says atheism is true. There's no claim I know how to make that says atheism is true.
Atheists, prove that atheism is true and accurate. Proving that atheism is true and accurate is easy. It's simple. It is the simplest affair possible. It is a walk in the park. It's a breeze. The hard part is getting Christians or Muslims or Hindus or whoever to acknowledge it. It's not that we can't prove it, it's just that you won't accept the proof. I was lying in the beginning of this video. I can't prove that atheism is true and accurate.
The question is, what proof and evidence do you have that atheism is true? Well, atheism is the position of not accepting the theological explanation. It cannot be proven to be true. It's not up to me to prove that there are no gods.
An interesting challenge that theists have offered to atheists is this: provide evidence that there is no God and that atheism is correct. An interesting challenge, to be sure, because it reveals more about the person presenting the challenge than it does about the existence of any deity. Now, in the first video I ever produced on YouTube, I listed a bunch of tools that theists use in debates with atheists. One of those is evasion, which is when someone ducks a question and tries to steer the conversation elsewhere. It looks a lot like what I'm doing now, talking about evasion, rather than providing proof that God doesn't exist. It asks for the impossible. You cannot prove a nothing. A more sophisticated way of saying it without the double negative is, it is impossible to positively prove a negative. Yes, your God is safe from being proven to be nothing.
What proof do atheists atheists have that atheism is true and correct? Well, you're operating from a false premise. I'm not stating that atheism is correct. In fact, I'm not stating anything. And the atheist doesn't need to prove anything. We, as atheists, don't have to have any evidence at all that there is no God.
Challenged atheists to prove that atheism is both accurate and correct. There needs to be something that absolutely proves that there's a God in order for us to believe that there's a God. And there's nothing on this planet that can absolutely 100% convince me that there is a God. You cannot convince me that there is a God, no matter how hard you try. I don't care.
Proves that atheism is true, and yeah, I don't know. I guess I feel like I can make a few comments here. The problem is that it's irrational, that nobody actually knows what the hypothesis is, so there's no way to argue for its alleged truth or falsity, and actually, I don't think that truth has any place in science. The fact is that the word does not point to anything. It's an irrational concept, and so any hypothesis which starts out with God as being part of a hypothesis would be irrational, because nobody would know what the hell anybody else is talking about. So there's no point in, well, not only is there no point, it's impossible to prove or disprove, because what are you proving? What are you disproving?
I'm here to tackle this stupid question. In the real world, asking for the proof or evidence that atheism is true is just stupid, because you don't need evidence for atheism. Is it guaranteed to be true? No, but you're playing the odds here. It's probably accurate. You don't think atheism isn't true unless you're an idiot. Next time you come up with a question, make sure you phrase it properly. I've seen people's heads explode trying to wrap their head around the concept of your question. And while it's a clever little trick that may score idiot points, anyone who pays attention or anyone who looks up a refutation to your argument is going to see how crap it is.
Can you prove that atheism is true and accurate? That question is incoherent. That question displays a lack of understanding of what atheism is and what atheism means. Let's split this question into two parts. First part, you have atheism. Second part, you have